Hello, welcome everybody to this School Streets webinar. It's 12 p.m, so we will get started. Thanks to everyone who's joining us today. We're going to keep everyone who's in the audience on mute throughout the webinar. So if you have any technical issues, please use the chat box. We're also using the chat box for any questions. So you can keep those coming in throughout the webinar. So welcome to this webinar presented by Green Communities Canada in partnership with 880 Cities.
That down a little bit.
Sorry about that interference. So welcome everybody. Green Communities Canada is a national association of community organisations working from the ground up for transformative change in areas like zero waste, eco-efficient homes and businesses, active transportation and green infrastructure. We have been the lead organisation promoting active school travel in Ontario since 1996. And we do this through research, advocacy, training, resources, events, partnerships and on-the-ground programming. 880 Cities works to improve the quality of life for people in cities by bringing citizens together to enhance mobility and public space so that together we can create more vibrant, healthy and equitable communities. You will hear more about 880 Cities and the fantastic work that they do later in this webinar. My name is Kate Berry and I am the Programme Director for Ontario Active School Travel, a programme of Green Communities Canada. The goal for our Ontario Active School Travel programme is to make walking, cycling and other forms of active and sustainable transportation the norm for school trips. We gratefully acknowledge financial support from the Government of Ontario, which is enabling Green Communities Canada to provide support for walk and wheel to school initiatives in a record-setting 50 communities in Ontario. This webinar is part of the central resources and support services that we provide to propagate knowledge sharing and learning amongst people with a shared interest in active school travel and safer school zones. So we're very excited to bring you this transatlantic webinar today with two presentations focused on the school streets concept. First, we will hear from the London Borough of Hackney, a municipality that has pioneered the installation of school street zones in London, England, with 4 permanent zones established to date and I think 3 more pilots underway in 2019. We'll then fly over to Toronto to hear from 880 Cities and their work to pilot the school street concept in Canada, with recent pop-up initiatives in Toronto schools and a school streets guide developed for the regional government over on the west coast of Canada. We'll have time for, at the end of the presentations, for discussion. So during the presentations, we encourage you to type your questions into the chat box and send that to everyone. We'll be tracking the questions as they come in so that we can work through them together after the presentations. And this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the Ontario Active School Travel YouTube channel. We will email everyone who registered for this webinar to send you a direct link to the recording when it's available. So before I hand over to our presenters, we'd like to get a feel for who is in the audience today. So we're going to bring up a quick poll on the screen and ask you to tell us which type of organization you represent. So please vote on the options that you see in front of you and choose the one that's most relevant. If there isn't an option that fits you, then please choose other. Okay, so we'll just give everyone a few more seconds to get their votes in, and then we will display the results. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So I will end the polling now. And now you should see the results of that. So we've got a great mixture here between some of the key stakeholders who have a role in promoting active school travel and supporting safe school zones across those different options. And we've even got some parents on this webinar today. So that's fantastic. We're great. We're really happy that you are tuning in too. Okay, Selena, have you, you've got a copy of those results? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. So without further ado, I will now hand over to our first presenters, to our friends Tyler Linton and Doolin O'Reilly at the London Borough of Hackney for our first presentation. So Tyler and Doolin, it's over to you, and I have unmuted you.
Okay, thanks. Hi there. We're just going to get our presentation up on the shared screen.
Wonderful. Good morning, Tyler. I can hear you well.
Good evening. Yeah.
Good evening for you, indeed.
Kate, is that working there? Are we
Yes.
sharing the screen? Okay.
Yes, I can see your slides.
Great. And the sound is okay, Kate?
And we can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks very much for this opportunity to present. As Kate mentioned, my name is Tyler Linton. I'm the Sustainable Transport Manager at the London Borough of Hackney. I'm here with...
I'm Doolin O'Reilly. I'm the Principal Sustainable Transport Planner at Hackney Council.
And we're going to talk a little bit about school streets. But first, normally, giving this presentation, I'd be able to ask for a show of hands to see who in the audience could find Hackney on a map. But since I can't do that, I'll give you a brief introduction to Hackney, just to give us a bit of context. I'll talk about Hackney as a place and how we got to a position of installing school streets, and Doolin will take over and talk about the results of the first 5 sites that we've done. So Hackney is one of 33 local authorities in London. It's got a population of 280,000. It's fairly central. It's a part of London we call Inner London, but you can see the south side of the borough is adjacent to the historic financial centre of London, the City of London. Whereas the eastern side of Hackney, it sort of sticks out like a triangle to the east. That is actually where the first commercial plastic factory was, and that was 150 years ago. And it was a bit of a post-industrial site until the Olympics of 2012, and it's now undergoing rapid change. London as a whole is growing very rapidly, expecting 1.5 million people in the next 10 years. And a lot of those people will be moving to East London, so we face some challenges. Hackney's got a bit of a reputation, both in London, the UK, and internationally, for being a site of the Hackney hipster. It's often compared to Brooklyn, and it certainly has had its share of rapid change in the last 15, 20 years. It's got a strong nighttime economy, strong tech economy, strong creative and media economy, but that's only part of the story. To give an idea of the rest of the community and the community spirit in Hackney, about 13 years ago, a very popular property show on TV here labeled Hackney as the worst place in the UK to live. And in response, the mayor at the time launched a campaign, just a very simple I Love Hackney campaign, and it really picked up a lot of support from residents in the borough. It's still to this day, you see I Heart Hackney badges everywhere, really because there's an awful lot of pride. There's a historic community that are very proud of the diversity in Hackney. 36% of the population of Hackney self-identify as white British. That's pretty low, even for London. 76% speak English as their main language. There's over 80,000 languages spoken. It's the largest, home to the largest Orthodox Jewish population outside of Israel and New York City. It's a very young population. There's 68,000 residents under the age of 19. And interestingly, more residents cycle to work than drive. 15% of residents cycle to work versus 12% drive to work. So it's an interesting and unique place. It does have a number of challenges that come with a rapidly changing place, and a place where the urban fabric is diverse as well as the people. The different environments require different solutions. So what we're talking about today, school streets, is really just one part of a bigger approach. We have a very strong approach to reducing motor vehicle dominance in the borough. We subscribe to the Healthy Streets Principles, which is the colorful wheel on the top left, which essentially puts walking and cycling, because of its health benefits, at top priority for the transport network. And today we're going to look at school streets and how it fits into this wider program. So obviously the journey to school is really important. We probably don't need to explain that to everybody on the webinar today. You've all dialed in for the same reason. We think that if children are able to walk and cycle to school, it's a sign that your transport system is healthy. And equally, if they're not, then it doesn't matter what else you're doing, you're probably not doing enough. Your transport system is not healthy. It's a major indicator. And with 68,000 young people in the borough, there's a big effect on the roads. So we all know about the school run traffic problem, and it's an issue here as well. So for well over a decade, we've been looking at making the journey to school healthier, safer, and more environmentally friendly, for all the same reasons you are. It's a life skill. It provides access to jobs later on in life. It helps social cohesion. It's good for physical activity. It's necessary to address the climate change emergency. And for 10 years, we've achieved some successes. This is a chart showing the percentage of Hackney pupils being driven to school by car versus sustainable modes. And since 2007, 2008, we've halved the number of children coming to school by car. And you can see most of the gain is in the first 5 years of that chart. And the reason we're talking about that is really to emphasize the point that school streets was not the sort of solution. It didn't just come out of nowhere. There was a long history of work in the background, community engagement work. The program included behavior change projects probably familiar to you, such as bikers' breakfasts, a walking initiative called Walk Once a Week, and the mascot is there on the right. It's run by a national charity called Living Streets. And we have a flagship cycling event and a world record for our event called Bike Around the Borough. I think it's important. The reason we're showing this slide is even before we start banning roads around schools, clearly we achieved some symbolic and cultural wins. These are photos of a council-run event, 1,000 children around the age of 10 to 13 on the roads during the school day, escorted by teachers. And you can see we've been able to present it as a normal everyday activity that doesn't require special gear. Around 5 years ago, we had achieved some success with these measures, but we wanted to do more, and we really wanted to lock in some of the behavior change that we'd seen through the campaigning. So we joined an EU-funded project called STARS Europe, and pretty early on, we learned that the city of Milan, one of the nine partners, had just started a program to ban traffic from out front of schools in Milan. The police would turn up and put up barriers, and we thought this was a great idea. Edinburgh were a member of that project as well, and they were the first in the UK, but Transport Scotland is slightly different, so we had to change our approach slightly from Edinburgh's. Now we're on to school streets. It's worth sort of defining what a school street is. In Hackney, it's a timed pedestrian and cycle zone, which means motor vehicles are not allowed to enter. They're prohibited during the times on the sign. So that's 45 minutes twice a day to coincide with school opening and closing times, 8:30 to 9:15 and 3:15 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's 5 days a week. We use cameras to issue tickets. That's something that's allowed in London. It's not allowed everywhere in the country, but it is allowed in London. And that means that we don't have to put up physical measures like barriers. It means emergency vehicles can go through if they need to. It means that residents who are inside the zone can leave even during the time periods where traffic is banned. So it's not a 100% ban of traffic, but it's a precise restriction at the time of the day where the streets in front of schools needed it the most. Our signs simply fold when it's school holidays. So the restriction only applies.
Hi, Tyler. We lost you for a couple of seconds there.
Oh, okay. Have you got me back? Okay.
Yes, we have now. If you could just maybe start from the top of that slide.
Okay, this slide is showing a school street on a normal day, which is rather boring. because this is twice a day. The streets are just clear for people to walk and cycle. Doesn't really make a good photo, but this is what we think success looks like, because this is normalized behavior. Here are some examples of things that we love to do, but are different than our school streets restrictions, because our school streets are twice a day, every school day of the year. It's 185 days a year. We can't put on a street party every day. We do to launch them, and we think that's great. We also do other walking and cycling promotions throughout the year, like the mentioned bike ride. We love street parties. Really, any excuse to close a street and have a party is good for us, but it's not what we consider a school street. A school street is really defined as the restriction to traffic on a normal day, not on a special day. When we set out to emulate the Italian and Scottish approach to banning traffic, we chose 5 pilot locations. We chose them based on which schools in the borough had the worst air quality, which is measured by the Greater London Government. And we invited those 27 schools to express an interest. 13 of them replied, and out of those 13, we prioritized 5 based on those who were the most engaged with us on other measures, because we knew we really needed their support in the first sort of batch. We looked at where the highest percentage of car use was at these schools, so that we could address where the greatest potential for change was. But we also deliberately chose 5 very different street layouts so that we could prove the concept. We didn't just want to do 5 cul-de-sacs and prove that you could close a low traffic cul-de-sac. We deliberately chose a mixture of road layouts. The road on the right of the screen carried 9,000 vehicles a day before the school street was put in. So that's a pretty, that would be considered a medium busyness in London. And it required, because it carried significant traffic, it required 2 additional measures to prevent high volumes of traffic from just going straight around it. So we didn't shy away from tricky locations. In the early days in 2017, we did get some negative press, largely because we were issuing tickets using cameras, and that's not popular in any country. We were accused of just making money rather than making children's journeys safer and healthier. And I'll pass you over to Doolan to talk about whether or not we were successful or whether our critics were right.
Hi there, everyone. So what were the impacts of our pilot? I started with some before and after images because some of our photos of the pilots of the school streets really are worth 1,000 words. This is one of our school streets pilots from London Fields Primary School. On the left is a shot from before the implementation, and on the right is after the implementation, so you can really see the difference. Again, this is another before and after shot. This is from Tyson Primary School, another one of our pilots. And before and after photos are great, but they aren't enough to prove success. We knew there were skeptics of the scheme, so we put a lot of effort into ensuring that we evaluated the pilot thoroughly. One of the things we monitored was how pupils were getting to and from school. Our monitoring showed an increase of active travel across the pilot schools. Notably, all of our pilot schools showed an increase in the number of children cycling, even from a high starting point. Monitoring also showed that the number of children being driven to school decreased. The one exception is where our school, St. John the Baptist, but this was due to an increase in the school intake between the before and after surveys. Before the pilots went in, one of the most commonly voiced concerns and assumptions was that the scheme was simply going to displace traffic to surrounding roads. In order to study this, we performed traffic counts on the school street roads and on the surrounding roads, both before and after the implementation.
Hi, Doolan, we lost you. Hi, Doolan, we're not able to. Hi, Doolan, we lost you for about 30 seconds there.
That's fine. Should I just start again on this slide?
Yes, please.
All right, so Before the pilots went in, one of the most commonly voiced concerns had to do with the scheme simply displacing traffic. That was a concern for people who were not sure about school streets. They thought that traffic was just going to move away from the school street school and onto surrounding roads. In order to study this, we performed traffic counts on the school street roads and on the surrounding roads before and after the implementation of the school street. The traffic data showed that the traffic in the school street zone went down by an average of 68%, and it also found that traffic was not being displaced en masse to neighboring streets. So, as you can see on this chart and image here, we've given a before and after traffic count chart that shows that the displacement doesn't happen. So this is from Tyson, one of our pilot schools. The blue part of the bars represent the traffic volume on the road that the school street is on. And the orange part of the bars represent the traffic volume of the parallel road, which is the natural alternative route to the school street. As you can see from this chart, while some of the traffic may have moved onto a nearby street, the total traffic volume in the area has decreased. So really, the scheme resulted in more traffic evaporation than traffic displacement. We also considered the air quality impacts of the scheme. We commissioned a study from King's College London, and they are the air quality research experts in the UK. The results showed that the total vehicle emissions of NOx, particulate matter of 10 micrograms, and particulate matter of 2.5 micrograms dropped by 74% at the pilot schools. So, in summary, the pilot of Hackney's school street scheme showed an increase in active travel to school, a decrease in children being driven to school, a case against the assumption of traffic displacement, and an improvement in local air quality. Since the success of Hackney's school street pilots, our work has been recognized as best practice, and we have conducted a public relations campaign with the intent of expanding the idea to other places. And we've received significant national media attention, this time positively. As you can see in the top left, our mayor was on BBC Newsnight, which is the equivalent of CBC. It's the major news show in the UK, talking about school streets and promoting its benefits. So what does the future hold? Since the implementation of our 5 pilot school streets, we have made 4 of them permanent. And we have also implemented 3 more school streets, with our 9th school street planned for implementation in January 2020. We've also recently announced that we will be putting a school street at every primary school in Hackney. And as Hackney has 55 primary schools, you can see this turns into having a school street on almost every block in the borough. Hackney is committed to sharing our knowledge with other municipalities. As a result, we provide a number of best practice material. Firstly, Hackney has produced a school street toolkit for professionals. It's been circulated to every municipality in the UK and is free for international municipalities as well. The link can be found at the bottom of that slide. Secondly, Hackney's created a promotional video for school streets. It shows highlights of Hackney's work in school streets, including testimony from teachers and parents. Again, this is free to use and is an accessible way to get people familiar and on board with the concept of school streets. We've made this available to everyone listening to the webinar by the link in this slide below. Thirdly, Hackney is open for business in terms of sharing our knowledge and experience. We conduct webinars like this one, host study tours, and can provide over-the-phone support. We have consulted over 20 municipalities, including Singapore and Oslo, about school streets, and are eager to help replicate our success both in the UK and abroad. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Just to make sure we're not going over time, Tyler and I will stick around for the question period, and we are happy to provide more detail if anyone requests it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tyler and Doolin. I will, if you can stop sharing, and I will bring back our main slide deck briefly. Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for your patience. We had a couple of little glitches with the audio, and we had a glitch with the capacity on Zoom, which wasn't supposed to happen. We fixed that now, so if you do know someone who was trying to get in and couldn't, you can let them know. Okay, so and we'll now move across the Atlantic and welcome Amanda O'Rourke and the 880 Cities team to present on their School Street initiatives here in Canada. So over to you, Amanda, Siva, and Candice, if you want to now share your slides with us.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Kate. My audio's okay?
It is. Hello, Amanda.
Hi. Hi, everyone. We're just pulling up our slides here. Hoping that you can see that.
Yes.
Wonderful. So, hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to Kate and Green Communities Canada for this opportunity. My name's Amanda O'Rourke, and I'm joined by Siva and Candice on my team. We at 880 Cities were actually really inspired by the work of our colleagues in the UK. And it was actually about a year ago that we heard that kind of same presentation that you all heard from them and thought, how could we bring and introduce this concept to Canada, to our hometown of Toronto? And so that's the story that we're going to share with you today. So Siva was the project lead on our first pop-up school street in Toronto. And I say pop-up very intentionally. It was not a full-on pilot. It was more of an introductory to the concept. And Candice has been leading the development of a school street guidebook in partnership with the City of Victoria and the Capital Region District. So she's going to talk a little bit about that so we can share the resources that we've created for a Canadian context. So before we go into that, just a quick, Kate talked a little bit about this, 880 Cities, we're a nonprofit organization. We are based in Toronto, but we work internationally. And our mission is to improve the quality of life for people living in cities, no matter their age, ability, or socioeconomic status. We've been working with about 300 cities over the last 12 years, kind of challenging them on the way they design their streets and public spaces. And we do that by starting with a very simple, but we think powerful question. And that is, what if everything we did in our cities was great for an 8-year-old and an 8-year-old? And we think if you start to think that way and apply that lens, you start to really create cities that work better for everyone. So when we use this lens, sort of coming down to the Toronto context, we see that our kids actually aren't doing so well here in Canada and in Toronto. We know also that children and older adults, but children, when we're talking about schools, are disproportionately negatively affected by street design that really prioritizes cars. They are more vulnerable to road danger, and this was really a big reason why we wanted to introduce school streets to our city here. The city had recently, in 2016, the City of Toronto endorsed Vision Zero, which probably many people on this webinar are familiar with. If you're not, it's a really simple concept. It's the idea that all fatalities on our streets are preventable, and we can aspire to get those fatalities down to zero. So that is the vision that the city endorsed. And we really think that this is a model program. School Streets is a model program that can help achieve that. At 880 Cities to sort of advocate for better road design because this is a critical issue for children and older adults who have been sort of marginalized by a very car-centric planning paradigm. And actually, recently we were approached in 2018 from a local Torontonian who in 2018, one of her friends was killed, one of the 46 people killed on Toronto's streets in 2018. And she came to us wanting to provide a donation and say, you know, how can we elevate the conversation on road safety in the city? How can we actually get people thinking differently about the role of our streets? So we had conceived of the project 880 Streets, which was really an urban experiment that would allow Torontonians to imagine what a more human-centered street looks and feels like, and sort of build it collectively with the community. So we launched a series of 3 demonstration projects. The first one was 880 Streets Danforth, which was transforming one of the largest commercial corridors in 24 hours into a more complete human-centered street. It was Canada's first Vision Zero pop-up. It lasted 2 days. And then we moved our way to Pineway, which was a residential street in front of a school zone, employing very simple pop-up materials to calm traffic in an area that had seen a lot of speeding cars around a school zone. But those were the first two. And the third one, we thought, you know, inspired again by Hackney and a lot of other pioneering European cities, we thought, how about we introduce the school street model to Toronto as our third demonstration project. It was a really exciting opportunity, we thought, to work here directly in our city and introduce something new. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Siva, who will talk about what that experience was like.
Thanks, Amanda. So hello, I'm Siva. I'm a project manager at 880 Cities, and I had the great luck to be put in charge of putting together this school street. And as Amanda mentioned, we learned a lot from Hackney Council about how to do this, and we also benefited from some great partners. So when we knew that we wanted to think about how to make a street near a school safer, and we decided that a school street would be a good model to try, we went to a local city councillor, Gord Perks, and asked him about whether there were any schools in his ward that might be interested in this kind of project. He suggested reaching out to Keele Street Public School because that school had been really interested in any kind of safe street project that might help them with some of the chaotic traffic that they were experiencing in the mornings and afternoons. And so we met with the school principal. We also met with the sustainability office at the Toronto District School Board. They have a charter to promote active transportation within all Toronto schools. So anything that could promote active transportation fit in with their mandate. And so we met with them over the summer and decided that this would be a good experiment, this pop-up. And we got a lot of support from the councillor's office with reaching out to city staff about next steps to take to figure out how to go about it. To start by, it's worth talking a little bit about why this particular street and this school did make sense. This is Mountview Avenue, which is the residential street next to Keele Street Public School that has the main entrance to Keele Street Public School. And on normal days, it's a fairly narrow street. And on normal days, there's usually a lineup of parked cars with parents idling or stopping briefly to let their children out, while there are also drivers going in that same direction and drivers coming the other way. Sometimes those drivers end up mounting the sidewalk to get around the congested roadway. So parents and students have seen this for many years, and so there was increasing community support for anything that could help alleviate this kind of traffic. It's also a very dense neighborhood where there were already a lot of students walking to school. So it wasn't as much a question of behavior change, it was about creating a situation that would be safer for the students who were already walking. What you don't see in this photo is that on the right is the school building, and on the left are 3 apartment towers. The school has over 600 students, and a large number of them come from the apartment towers right across the street. So they cross the street mid-block while all these drivers are mounting sidewalks and doing 3-point turns and going very quickly through the street. There have actually been collisions on the street in the past where children have been hit. So, so the student community and the staff community and the parent community was really interested in trying something new. This is an overhead map of the school that shows where it's located. Keele Street is a very busy street that where the speed limit is 50 kilometers an hour. And then Mountview is a small residential street. That's the photo that you just saw. And we implemented the School Streets program on this one block where we closed it to cars and opened it to people, the way that we heard from Hackney Council. The school's parking lot is actually accessed off Glen Lake Avenue, which you see at the top of the screen. And this particular block doesn't have any driveways or residential parking. So we were lucky. It was already very well set up to be closed to car traffic. There was one thing that we had to make accommodations for, which is that the apartment tower community had an underground parking garage that exited onto that block that we were blocking off. So we had to make sure that anyone who would normally come out of that entrance would use a different entrance, a different exit of the parking garage instead, and that we included it as part of our maneuvers to block the street to cars. What we used to block the streets were these barricades. So Hackney Council talked about using cameras. This was just a pop-up for 4 days. So we used physical barriers, and these are CNC cut plywood. They were assembled by volunteers. It's using a design that comes from Wikiblock, which you can Google. But they're cut out of plywood. The volunteers are able to assemble them together with no nails or screws. And then we painted them to make them colorful and inviting. But school streets can use anything as a barrier. One of our partners for this project, that I neglected to mention when I was talking about our partners earlier, was EcoKids, which is an organization in Toronto that implements play streets, which is a different model of blocking neighborhood streets to cars to allow children to play in the streets. And what they have seen neighbors use is anything from a chair in the middle of the street to a garbage can. Anything can function as a barrier. And then how did it work? Well, as soon as we knew that we had the support of the school, we reached out to the city with support from the councillor's office. And it took the city some weeks to figure out what kind of permit would make sense for this kind of project. Normally they deal with street events, events that shut down the whole street, like a street festival or a performance or a marathon. And this was a situation where we were asking about shutting the street down for only a short amount of time on a daily basis and not for an event. So it took them some time. They decided that we should apply for a street event application after all. Because we had the capacity to spend some time thinking through all of the expectations, we were able to complete the street application. One of our goals, if this does become a more widely accessed project for Toronto, would be to work with the city to create a simplified process for street permit applications so that other communities are able to apply for it more easily. The Play Streets model that I mentioned that EcoKids, our partner, supports, does have a simplified permit application model. One other side point about this is that the City of Toronto's street event permit application required us to provide insurance that would cover the street during the time of the closure, which we were able to provide as an organization. But if this were done by a community group or neighbors, they wouldn't necessarily have access to that. So that's one more thing to consider in the permitting process. And then we also, as we were going through this permit application process, I meant to say one more thing about the permit application process, which is that the reason that this pop-up was 4 days long was that that's the maximum length, according to the City of Toronto's permit application process. That's the maximum length that would require a simple application. If it had been any longer, we would have had to get council approval at our local community council. And so to make the process as straightforward as we could, we decided to stick to 4 days. And then we worked with the school to promote the pop-up to the school community. So this TDSB school, TDSB Eco Schools, which is also available across Ontario through the Eco Schools nonprofit organization, works within schools to promote active transportation projects and leadership opportunities for students. And so the Eco Schools Eco team at the school gathered together to make posters, do morning announcements, and do classroom visits to promote the pilot. And they did use these pictures of launch day, which in Hackney, which showcase what we heard earlier is not a typical school street, but we were planning to do something like this for the first day launch. So we really made it about not just walking to school safely, but that it would be a celebration on that first day and a chance to enjoy a car-free street. We also did create these flyers that we sent home with students for parent information, and we distributed these flyers around the neighborhood to all of the houses on that street and to the apartment towers. And then came the launch day. We worked with EcoKids to really go big with loose parts. So it's this model of free play where children can play with items like tires or milk crates or things like this. And then we literally rolled out the red carpet to encourage students to see the street as their space now, just for this time. We used 3 volunteers every morning and every afternoon, 1 for each end of the block and 1 in front of the parking garage entrance, as you see here. And they explained about the project to anybody who wasn't aware of it, and also redirected traffic. In some cases, there were situations, which I'll go into in a moment, where there might have been a driver who had still remained parked on the street and was still in there when the school closure started. And so these volunteers were also able to accompany them safely out of the closure area and move aside the barricade for them. As I mentioned, because this was a block that didn't have any residential driveways or access to parking, we made it a completely car-free zone, unlike the Hackney examples you heard where residents would have access. But that's what made sense for this particular street. And as soon as we opened it, our #1 priority was improving safety for students who were already walking to school. And so that was our top concern. We weren't sure what the street would actually look like and whether children would play on the street when they already had playgrounds and other green space at the school to enjoy instead. We expected it to look very similar to the Hackney photos where not much was necessarily happening. But it turned out that something magical happens when you open up a street and make it into public space, especially in a city like Toronto, where we don't often have the opportunity to think about streets as places for people. Children loved being able to run around the street, and even adults love the novelty of walking where they would normally have to be worried about cars. So the street that is normally filled with cars is filled with laughter and chatter. This child came out right at 8 a.m. to have the chance to play on the empty street. And even when it rained on multiple days, we had children enjoying the street. It's worth mentioning also that normally this happened in late October, normally at this time of year, and in the rain, it's a time when children have to be more worried about the safety of walking and going to school, but a car-free street is the safest option for these children. Throughout the project, we did a lot of engagement with the community to understand the impacts of the school streets pop-up in terms of their qualitative experience of it. And we did this with these engagement boards where we used Dotmocracy to get feedback and also use Post-its to take down comments. And we had one engagement board specifically for children where we asked them how they felt about it. And throughout the week before and the week of the pop-up, we also got data from each classroom with help from the school's eco team about how the students got to school each day. The lessons that we learned were that we were not sure what to expect in terms of the amount of traffic that we might have seen at the edges of the closure. And what we found was that it was less of an issue than we were expecting. As it turned out, about 70% of the school population was already walking to school and 10% were taking transit. So it was a very small proportion of the population that was being driven. And we encountered parents who actually told us that this pop-up had helped them see that normally they would drive their kids, and that the pop-up had helped them see that they lived closer than they thought, and it was possible to walk. It was really helpful that this particular school was already very actively involved, really interested in school safety, and had this eco team of students who were already promoting active transportation and were ready to go with encouraging their peers. And we also learned that this project is actually quite cheap and quite doable, and it's a quick thing to adapt and implement anywhere that would like to do it. So it doesn't have to be seen as a complicated idea. And it was a good way for us to show the school and show the city actually what this would look like. And we got overwhelmingly positive responses from all the parents that we talked to, all the teachers, all the students, and from across the city. Out of these over 600 students, we got one email that that told us that the parent had some trouble getting used to a different routine, which is to be understood. So I'm going to pass this over now to Candace, who can tell you more about our guidebook to help other communities be able to implement the school streets model for themselves.
Thanks, Siva. Hi, everyone. My name is Candace Leong. I'm a project coordinator with the organization. And while Siva was managing Toronto's first ever School Streets pop-up, I was working on developing a guidebook. So the School Streets Guidebook was developed in partnership with the Capital Regional District of British Columbia and the City of Victoria. It details everything from what a school street is, the benefits of it, some case study examples, and a series of resources to help people kickstart school streets. In early 2019, an elementary school in Victoria, BC, Sir James Douglas Primary, hosted a School Streets pop-up of their own. The pop-up was organized largely by the parents involved in the school's active travel committee that had been exploring ways to promote active transportation for students, promoting things like Walk and Reel Week initiatives and things like that. But they were still struggling with the traffic congestion that they were seeing in front of the schools during those peak drop-off and pickup times. Their pop-up lasted just one day, but garnered a great deal of attention with local neighbors and city staff. So here are some of the lessons that they learned. Similar to the way that we went big with our launch day, they also hosted things like a bake sale. They had some cool bikes to show off and very much promoted kids to play on the street to get, as a way to encourage anyone that was walking by to get involved in the program. They also noticed that, similar to the examples that we heard earlier, that displaced traffic really wasn't as big of an issue as they expected. And lastly, kind of for food for thought, I guess, they noticed that one of the substitute teachers that unfortunately was not notified of the school streets was taken by a bit off guard by the project. So just a reminder for future school streets initiatives to think of irregular staff as well as when you're doing your outreach. Although the pop-up lasted just one day, it got a great deal of attention, and there was recognition that school streets, there's an appetite for school streets in North America, but that there is also a pretty significant learning curve in navigating the planning process to move these programs forward. So that largely inspired the development of the guidebook. As I mentioned, the guidebook includes some of the amazing points that was mentioned earlier from the Hackney Borough Council. But it really strives to ground these examples and these resources in a British Columbia and Canadian context. The guidebook breaks down the coordination of a school street into 3 main phases and includes different steps under each phase and some tips and resources to help you go along. One of the things that we heard loud and clear from the project team was a need for evaluation tools. So things like surveys, like travel counts, because this is a fairly foreign street typology, we wanted to understand the impacts that it made in a more local context. But in addition to the evaluation tools, there's also things like signage, sample notices, and things like that. So before we move on to the question period, a lot of these resources are available on our website. We'll be sure to link them in the chat box as well moving forward. But I also wanted to kind of address the question that we've been getting kind of nonstop since we've done these projects. And that is the big question of, well, what's next now that you've done, you know, Toronto's first pop-up, you have the School Streets Guidebook. And frankly, one of the first things that we wanted to do was something like this, proactively work to communicate the broad-reaching benefits of school streets, that they are very easy, simple, low-cost ways to create a more safe environment for our most vulnerable road users. The other piece we wanted to move forward with is refining the process. So Siva mentioned how the permitting process was a bit confusing, and there's a huge opportunity to streamline that. Lastly, there's a huge appetite to scale these projects up further. The pop-up that Toronto had, it lasted 4 days. The pop-up in Victoria, BC lasted 1 day. So there's a great opportunity to push for an actual pilot of school streets. So with that, I will pass it back to Kate to facilitate the question period.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Candice and Siva and Amanda. That was very interesting. So I'm going to quickly move along to questions and answers so that we've got a few that have come into the chat box. So I'm just going to bring my slides back up on the screen here. Okay, great. So I'm going to start with some questions that came in during the London Borough of Hackney presentation. So these are a couple of questions for Doolin and Tyler. So there was interest in knowing, you were talking about expanding this School Streets initiative borough-wide, and whether, if you do that, will the timing of your school street zones, the times that they happen, will that be a borough-wide standard time, or would it be specific to each school?
Hi, so this is Doolin from Hackney Council. And at the moment, we run school streets on, as Tyler said, a 45-minute period during school opening and closing times. Most of them, have the same time, but that doesn't mean that at every school street at the moment they have the same time. We have one school street that runs for both a primary and a secondary school that happen to be on the same street, and that has extended times in order to cover the different opening and closing times of the secondary versus the primary school. We are considering to expand the times of the school streets beyond the 45 minutes borough-wide. So it's something that we are open to and considering. 45 minutes for the moment has worked for us, but it doesn't mean that we can't be expanding it a little bit wider in terms of the times across the borough. Yeah, and we're looking for standardization more than we are setting it for specific schools. We just find that that will be a little clearer to drivers and residents, et cetera, in the area. So we are looking into standardization across the area at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Doolin. And I think I'm kind of going to amalgamate some questions here. There was interest in, to what extent is the transit options in the schools that you've been working with, is the subway system, and obviously you have a lot of buses, public buses too. So whether, transit is a common mode as part of the school journey, for a bit of context, and whether you've seen evidence of increased use of active transportation amongst adults, and behavior change amongst parents of letting their kids walk unaccompanied at the schools that you've been working with. If you could address those kind of contextual questions collectively.
I think I can take those. The first question was around other transport options. Interestingly, around 15 years ago, there was a big national push on school travel plans. And that was part of an initiative that was actually looking to North America as the ideal transport solution. There was a trend towards more and more children being driven to school. And it looked like even just, holding that trend to a plateau would be a success. And there was serious consideration given to publicly funding yellow school buses, North American style school buses, which didn't exist except for a few private schools here. At the time, London introduced a free transport pass for children. And that's a very good option. But actually in Hackney famously doesn't have any underground stations, has a very good bus network. But actually, I saw another comment saying there's actually in Canada, it's common for children to get driven short distances. And that's certainly true of Hackney. It's not just about density of population, but actually it's about density of schools. And there's enough schools in London that children don't really live more than 1.5 kilometers, a mile away from their school, and yet they were still being driven. So taking the transit wouldn't really address that because it's too short of a journey. It's only 2 bus stops. So really that wouldn't be a way of addressing the rise in car travel. The second question was about adult active travel. And we have seen a trend across the borough of increasing active travel amongst all age groups. We have the highest level of active travel in London, but it's still only 50%. It's not sort of every journey. To disaggregate that and to sort of associate any of that gain to any particular measure is very difficult. So I think what we'd say is together, all of the measures that we're doing, we think are working towards increasing active travel across the borough. But we would assume that some of that is at least from adults who are delivering children to school and then carrying on their journey. And if they're not already hopping in the car to drive to school, yeah, we think there probably is a benefit to that. And independent travel is a really good question. It's something that we're concerned about. We want to encourage independent travel. It's a really important life skill. It's not something we're particularly good at measuring at the moment. So the answer to that question is we don't know. Our primary measure is just whether or not children are walking, cycling, or taking public transport to school, not whether they're being delivered independently. But I think it's a good question. It's something that we should all be looking to try and encourage.
If I could just jump in quickly, Kate, to address that from our perspective for the pop-up.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, so because we only did the pop-up for 4 days, we don't have like sort of a big data set to look at sort of changes in attitudes or behaviors. But I will say, I think one of the big things that we noticed from doing the pop-up was a lot of parents with their children sort of stopping and looking and observing, and you sort of saw this thought process happening with people, a lot of sort of like, wow, this is interesting, this is completely different way to start and end the school day. There was a lot more, sort of just from observing it, a lot more conversation happening and chatting between parents, a lot more play between the kids, obviously, too. So we also saw some parents who had chosen to drive outside of the zone, letting their kids do those last few 50 meters by themselves to get to the door, which I think is sort of like a baby step towards that independent travel. And it was kind of a lot of thinking happening with the parents around, oh, maybe this is possible. Maybe my child might be more ready to do this on their own if they knew that it was completely safe directly in front of the school. So that's obviously just anecdotal and observatory, but there was definitely these moments when the closure happened, and a lot of sort of pondering parents looking around going, wow, this is something different, and this feels a lot better. I can sort of talk to my kid. It was quieter. The start of their day could be a short conversation instead of sort of like hurling them out of the car. So again, very, very much based on observation, but it was, as Siva mentioned, overwhelmingly positive, and I think attitude changing in terms of opening up imaginations.
Could I just add, that's inspired another response. Where we're trying to get to as well, by looking at potentially rolling out school streets to all primary schools, we'll be assessing them. That's 55 streets in our area that we might be closing at peak time. So even if we're not influencing adults who are delivering children to school, that is actually going to have network level impact on all traffic traveling through the borough, no matter where they're going, by making it slightly less convenient to drive through our part of town. We're pretty confident in the evidence that would suggest that should lead to something in the order of 10 to 20% traffic evaporation.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. I don't know if we lost you. Are you finished?
I finished.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Thank you. I'm just noting the time. We're close to 1 o'clock, which is the official end time of the webinar, but our presenters kindly agreed that they would stick around for discussion and questions. So if you're interested in that, just please, stay on the line. We're going to keep talking. Those who have to tune out, thank you very much for attending this webinar. It has been recorded. The recording will be shared on our YouTube channel, and we will email everyone who registered for the webinar to share that link with you. So thank you. So we'll continue with a bit more discussion and questions. I think one of the common themes that I'm seeing in the discussion questions is, questions about how does this work for schools that have low levels of active transportation? They have lots of students who are traveling on school buses, or they have a high rate of driving at present. How does it work for them? And then the other kind of component here, particularly with the Canadian climate, is people thinking about how would this work in the winter with snow and ice and things like that. So I don't know if Amanda, you want to start with your thoughts on those issues?
Sure. I think, the short answer is a lot is not known yet, because this is the first time we did the pop-up, and we did it in October where there was no snow. There was rain, and it worked totally fine as well. The way that we implemented the pop-up with the simple barricades, which you could basically just move to the side. So I imagine it wouldn't be a challenge for a snowplow, and especially given that the times were so specific, that is something that could be easily coordinated with city transportation, as we did with garbage trucks, for example. Siva also did an amazing job sort of organizing the logistics around the school bus drop-off. So the cool thing about Keele Street Public School was that the school bus was able to drop students off directly in front of the school street. So they got off the bus and entered that sort of beautiful red carpet zone, and were able to feel comfortable directly from the bus to getting to the front door of the school. In terms of smaller communities, I think a lot of it has to do not so much about the population size of the city. Victoria has a population of 90,000, but I think has a lot to do with the context of the surrounding community. Is there a lot of students that live within walking distance, as Tyler kind of mentioned, I think is probably the more interesting statistic to look at. And I think, just to be completely honest and transparent, it might not work in every context. So if there's in extremely rural areas where there's not that concentration, it may not work. It might not be the best intervention. So, or if the school street is on a major arterial, maybe an intervention that focuses on improving road design might be better in a Canadian context, is all I can say. So that remains to be seen, but I think there could be a lot of interest in sort of actually doing a full-on pilot that lasts a full year, where we could evaluate and measure that.
I have a couple of things to add to that, which is, number one, for the winter, regardless of the weather, children are walking to school all year. So we need to also acknowledge that winter can be a more dangerous time for children who are walking to school. 2 children died in Toronto in the winter, right at the end of school day in 2018. And so that's also something worth thinking about. It's not necessarily that about the success of the project in terms of whether we can convince people to use active transportation. It's the fact that children are already using active transportation, and we want to make the streets safer for them as they're doing it. When it comes to rural areas, something that I think about is that there are some schools in rural areas where children are not allowed to use active transportation to get to school, because the streets are considered so unsafe that the school doesn't want to allow them to consider walking or cycling, and so they're forced to take the bus or be driven. But if the street was made safer, if there was some way to implement a school streets model on the type, depending on the type of street, that would allow more children to have that option, and for parents to have the option to let their children do that.
Thank you, Amanda and Siva. Julian and Tyler, I don't know if you have anything more to add to that in terms of how school streets fits in different weather and low rates of active transportation. I mean, I think that my key takeaway from your presentation and your experience in Hackney is that the school street zone, it needs to be carefully designed and planned to fit with the specific context of the school that you're working with. And the good thing is that we're able to do that. We're able to, look at who needs access, where would the buses go, where are the entrances, where are people coming from, and accommodate those needs. But just over to you if you have any final kind of comments about the weather considerations or the types of schools that this works well for.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, comparability to other cities comes up all the time. I mean, we would have heard that 5 years ago. Well, Hackney's not like Milan. Milan's in Italy. Italy's sunny. Well, some of those are just assumptions about a place. It's pretty cold here today. I think it was around 0 degrees. I know it's been sub-zero in Canada, but there's a bit of a cliche about how much rain London gets, and people use that as a barrier, whether it's a psychological barrier, whether it's a political barrier. Oh, people won't cycle in London. It rains all the time. And what we've seen, there's actually quite a lot of municipalities across the UK doing something like school streets now. I mean, Edinburgh is 5 hours north of London. It's very dark in the winter. It's further north than Toronto, so the days are very short. So they have a daylight issue in the winter. It's also very cold and can be not a very pleasant environment for walking and cycling in. But we see smaller villages looking towards school streets, and the solution is slightly different in a sort of rural context, but it is possible, and there's other opportunities that we don't have. We don't really have the opportunity to promote a what's called here like a park and stride, a sort of park and walk scheme. And what we have seen with school streets is you get a dispersal of traffic around the zone. So there are some people who still drive, but then they have to walk the last sort of 300, 400 meters. And I think in a rural area, you have a potential to identify a sort of parking zone half a kilometer away from the school or a kilometer away from the school. And I don't know, it would be on a case-by-case basis, but there would be other local considerations that potentially are an asset that we don't have. So I would say don't rule them out just because of snow or the road's layout.
Thank you, Tyler. Okay, I'm going to do a last call for questions in the chat box. I have a couple more noted here. So I think these are ones for Amanda and Siva and Candice. Some questions related to your Toronto pop-up. And so one was quite specific. It was, how much did the insurance cost for your 4-day event closure? So people thinking about the logistics of this, but also interested in any plans to take that Mount View pop-up further, make it permanent, and have you had any other schools come forward as being interested at this time? So a few questions there for 880 Cities team.
In answer to the insurance question, we as an organization have insurance coverage for events that we put on, so we extended that insurance that we had to the event. We know that Play Streets in Toronto have an agreement where the local city councillor can supply the insurance on behalf of the city, and that's how Play Streets are able to take place in communities in Toronto. So those are two different models. It's worth adding that Green Communities Canada advises anyone concerned about insurance that encouraging active travel and reducing traffic congestion therefore does reduce traffic collisions, which actually reduces liability exposure for anyone concerned about liability. So there's an argument to be made that insurance shouldn't be required for this kind of event at all.
The other question was about making it permanent. So we had, as I mentioned, this sort of private donor that funded these 3 pop-ups. In terms of making Mount View permanent, I think we're still trying to figure out what is the best way to roll out and provide resources to communities that want to do something like this, and that has to be in partnership with the city who is responsible for the safety of our streets. So we actually, in terms of funding the continuation of pop-ups, I don't think that that's very sustainable, but I think there's an opportunity here to create, which is what we were doing sort of with the guidebook and with this webinar, is to create more appetite so that the city sort of comes in saying, how can we support this? Because they're very low cost. I can say that overall in the total materials from, volunteer vests to the planter boxes, I think we spent around $2,000. I mean, it's really, really low. There's a lot of volunteers already in the school community that, principals are already, unfortunately, having to manage traffic in front of the school, which is not really, shouldn't really be part of their job. So yeah, as Candace mentioned, we haven't really figured out how to make these permanent here in Canada. We just started, we just did this first pop-up in October, but we're happy to hear any feedback, especially from this group, which looks like they're very knowledgeable about working with a school community, to hear your feedback or how we might be able to do that and support that.
Thanks, Amanda. And we will email everyone who registered for this webinar to send you the link to the recording, but we'll also invite you that if you're specifically interested in taking this further in your community, we'll invite you to just sort of register your interest with us so that we can keep in touch as things develop. So thank you for that. We did get one more question for Doolin and Tyler, and that was interest in how did you garner political support for School Streets? What were the key kind of selling points for your political decision makers?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. I think to answer that, it's worth saying we didn't really have to win political support for the agenda of active travel for children or safer travel for children. That's something that almost all of our politicians would support right from the start. The challenge is making sure that the solution was viable and that we had answers to really intelligent technical questions. So the easiest sort of criticism that can be leveled at any politician from one of their opponents is that they've messed up a good idea. Their lack of managerial skill has taken a good idea. Of course we all support safer streets for children, but look at what these people have done. It doesn't make any sense. So we spent a fair amount of time researching what the right sort of legislation was to use, what the right enforcement strategy was, what sorts of journeys we would have to ensure could go through. We gave good amount of thought to what are we going to do about disabled children who are taking taxis to school, and obviously they're traveling at that time, and it would be counterproductive to be putting roadblocks in their way. So there were some very specific sort of technical questions we had to work through, and when we were able to do that, it was easy to convince the politicians. Well, in fact, it was the politicians who set us the task of solving the problems in the first place. They caught wind of the idea, and then it was a pretty easy sell from the beginning. And the whole way along, we discovered actually, I think keeping the focus on the safety of children and the health of children is essential, because that really is what it's about. And whenever somebody's trying to steer the conversation another way, to bring it back to that first principle. And it turned out everyone that we had to work with was really keen to make the journey to school safer for children, whether that was the police, who were happy to come down and help us launch the very first School Street, and really show public support for it, whether it was other council departments like the garbage collectors, like 880 Cities mentioned in their presentation, being willing to retime, or to the school buses for disabled children, rerouting their routes so that they weren't going through. They were all pretty keen to make the journey to school safer and healthier. So yeah, I think keeping the focus on that is probably key to winning people over.
Thank you very much, Tyler. So thank you, Cezanne. Yeah, focus on safety and health of children, and be able to show the politicians and decision makers that you have thought of everything, everything that could go wrong, or everything that needs to be considered. Okay, so I think we have reached another question. Last question just popped in. Okay, so this one's from 880 Cities. Did the Toronto pilot involve the police?
No, it did not, because it was such a small residential street. The street permitting office decided that it wasn't necessary to involve police. We have encountered requests for police for larger commercial streets when we've done events, and that's also one more barrier that it's worth trying to address. This belief that police are necessary to make street closures safe, when there are lots of cities around the world that do programs where they shut streets down with volunteer marshals. So so in this case, no.
For our big pop-up on Danforth, the police were involved, and they were, you know, it was good that they were there for that large commercial street. But for this, it was not necessary. But it's part of the review process through the city permissions that they signed off that it's fine.
Okay, thank you for that.
I will also just say, building off of what Tyler said before about the politicians, one of the wonderful things from our press conference for the launch of School Streets is our councillor, Gord Perks, who was supportive from the beginning. The first thing he said directly into the cameras was, "This is what the future of Toronto streets look like," which I thought was very compelling. I, you know, just to leave people with that this is a really simple model that could really have tremendous benefits for your community in the future and starting now.
That's very inspiring. Thank you, Amanda. I think there was one last question in the chat box, and I think you touched on this already in terms of the Mount View. It's a question about the School Streets pop-up affecting school busing operations. I know you mentioned that students were able to get off the bus right at the entrance to the car-free zone. From your experiences so far, has integrating this with school bus operations been problematic?
No, it's similar to Tyler's experience. When we came to, you know, the parent council, the principal, the school bus operators, overwhelmingly people were very supportive and said, you know, how can we make this work? And there is always a solution to any of the challenges. I think that anybody who's interested in making this work in their community, I think if you get a good stakeholder group and planning group on board, which is kind of outlined in the School Streets Guide, you can really find solutions to all these sort of small logistical challenges.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so I think we can bring this webinar to a close. It's been really fascinating, and I want to just say thank you so much to our presenters today, Tyler and Julian at the London Borough of Hackney, and Amanda, Siva, and Candice at 880 Cities. We really appreciate your time and the knowledge that you shared with us. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today for this webinar. You can stay in touch with us via the Ontario Active School Travel info at email address, our website, Twitter, and Facebook. If you've not already subscribed to our new e-newsletter, you can do that from our website, and that's a good way to keep in touch. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks.